They painted pig on obese girl's cabin door. Mountain man's art turned insult into town symbol. Fort Astoria huddled against the Oregon coast like a collection of weather-beaten driftwood, its crude cabins and warehouses clinging to the rocky shore where the Columbia River surrendered to the Pacific. In the autumn of 1826, the settlement had grown from a fur trading outpost into a modest fishing village, where the smell of salt, fish oil, and wood smoke permeated every plank and rope. Millicent Thorne's cabin stood at the village's southern edge, a solitary structure facing the churning gray waters. The building sagged slightly to one side, its cedar shakes darkened by constant mist, and the single window facing the main path was perpetually shuttered. Inside, beneath the low ceiling blackened by years of hearth smoke, Millicent worked by lamplight even during the day, her thick fingers moving with surprising dexterity through the tangled nets spread across her floor. At 23, Millicent possessed the build of someone born to endure broad-shouldered, heavy-set, with arms strengthened by years of pulling and mending the heavy fishing nets that were her livelihood. Her mother had been the same, and her grandmother before that, women built for labor rather than the delicate frames celebrated in the fashion plates that occasionally arrived from Boston or New York. But here, in this remote outpost where survival mattered more than appearance, Millicent had found her purpose in the honest work of net mending. The fishing captains respected her skill. Old Captain Hendricks claimed she could sense a weakness in hemp rope before it showed, preventing losses that would cost a season's catch. Captain Morrison said her knots held better than any his crew could tie. They paid her fairly in smoked salmon, coin when they had it, and the occasional bolt of sturdy cloth. But their sons were different. Thomas Hendricks, barely 19 and already drunk on his father's reputation, led the pack of young fishermen who made Millicent's life a torment. He'd started calling her Sea Cow 2 summers ago, and the name had stuck among his friends Marcus Cole, the blacksmith's boy who thought himself clever, Willem Chase, whose family owned 3 fishing boats, and Jacob Morrison, Captain Morrison's youngest, who laughed the loudest, though his eyes sometimes showed shame. They would call out as they passed her cabin, making grunting sounds, oinking like hogs. When Millicent walked to the trading post for thread and supplies, they would waddle behind her, mocking her gait. She learned to shop at dawn or dusk, to move through the village like a ghost, to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut. The women of the village were kinder but distant. They'd nod politely, accepting her mended nets with gratitude, but never invited her to their quilting circles or Sunday gatherings. Millicent existed in a lonely space between respect for her work and rejection of her person, a skilled tradeswoman who remained fundamentally alone. On the night of October 12th, Thomas Hendricks and his companions had spent the evening at Dutch Henry's Tavern, celebrating a particularly good catch. The whiskey flowed freely, loosening tongues and dissolving what little restraint the young men possessed. Someone later, no one could remember who, suggested decorating Millicent's cabin door as a joke. They arrived near midnight, stumbling and laughing, carrying a stolen pot of red paint meant for marking boat hulls. In the lamplight from their lantern, Thomas painted a crude pig on the weathered door, grossly fat, with a curling tail and an exaggerated snout. Above it, in dripping letters, Willem added, "Pig lives here." They stepped back, admiring their handiwork with the self-satisfaction of the drunk and thoughtless, then scattered into the night. Millicent discovered it at dawn when she opened her door to collect water from the rain barrel. The morning light illuminated the cruel mockery in all its stark ugliness. The pig was grotesque, deliberately so, with its bloated belly and tiny legs. The letters seemed to scream their message across the village. She stood frozen, the water bucket forgotten in her hand, feeling as if she'd been struck. Her breath came in short gasps. Around her, the village was beginning to wake fishermen preparing boats, children being called to breakfast, the normal sounds of morning. Soon everyone would see, everyone would know, everyone would laugh. Millicent retreated inside and bolted the door. For 3 days, Millicent remained in her cabin. She didn't answer when Captain Hendricks knocked, bringing the torn nets he needed mended. She ignored Mrs. Chen from the trading post, who left a basket of bread and cheese by the door. She sat in the darkness, overwhelmed by a shame so profound it felt like drowning. The mockery wasn't new, but this was different. This was permanent, painted on her home for all to see. It announced her humiliation to every person who walked past. She imagined the whispers, the pointing, the children asking their parents what the picture meant, and the parents explaining with poorly concealed smiles. On the second day, she heard voices outside Captain Morrison arguing with someone, his son Jacob perhaps, the words too muffled to distinguish, but the anger clear. It didn't matter. The damage was done. She had no family left. Her mother had died 3 years ago, her father long before that in a fishing accident when Millicent was 10. She had her skill, her cabin, and her solitude. Now even the cabin had been marked, branded with her shame. On the third day, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, she heard a different knock, firm but not demanding, accompanied by a deep voice she didn't recognize. "Miss Thorne, my name is Amos Blackwood. Captain Morrison asked me to call on you. I'm not here to gawk or gossip. I'm here about the door." Millicent remained silent, her hands twisted in her apron. "I was a whaling man for 15 years, the voice continued, patient and steady. "Learned to paint from a Portuguese sailor in the Azores. We did ship paintings, figureheads, decoration work. I've heard what happened, and I'd like to help. Not to fix it or hide it, but to transform it into something better." Something in his tone, the complete absence of pity or mockery, the matter-of-fact offer of assistance, made Millicent rise and unbolt the door. Amos Blackwood stood perhaps 6 feet tall, lean and weathered like seasoned wood, with gray streaking his dark beard and deep lines around eyes that had squinted against too many horizons. He wore a fringed buckskin jacket, canvas trousers, and carried a worn leather satchel. He was perhaps 40, with the bearing of someone who'd seen hardship and emerged neither broken nor hardened, but tempered into something quietly strong. "Thank you for opening the door," he said simply. "May I look at it from inside?" Millicent nodded, stepping back to let him enter. Her cabin was dim but clean, with nets stacked neatly in the corner, her few possessions arranged with care. Amos studied the door from the interior, then stepped outside to examine it in the fading light while Millicent watched from the threshold. "They have no talent," he said finally, "but they've given us a canvas. With your permission, I'd like to spend a few days working on this. I won't simply cover it. I want to transform it into something that honors what you've endured and who you are." "Why would you do this for me?" Millicent's voice cracked from disuse. "You don't even know me." Amos turned to face her, his expression serious. "Because I know what it's like to be judged by what people see rather than who you are. I killed a man once in self-defense, defending a Chinook woman from her attacker, but all people saw was a mountain man who'd committed murder. I had to leave my trading post, my friends, everything I'd built. Captain Morrison gave me a chance here, looked past the story to the man. I'm returning that kindness." Amos arrived at dawn the next morning with an array of supplies pigments ground from minerals and plants, brushes made from various animal hairs, oils for mixing, and several wooden panels for testing colors. Captain Morrison had donated them, along with a public apology to Millicent for his son's behavior and the news that Jacob and his friends were being put to work repairing the worst of the fishing boats as punishment. "I need you to tell me about your work," Amos said as he began preparing his palette. "About what the ocean means to you, about why you chose to live here at the edge of everything." At first Millicent could barely speak, unused to being asked about herself. But as Amos worked first carefully outlining the existing pig, studying its shape, she found herself talking. She described how her mother had taught her to read the tides, to predict weather by the color of the dawn sky. She spoke of the satisfaction in mending a net so perfectly that captains couldn't find the repair. She admitted her love for the wild coast, for storms that shook her cabin, for the eternal conversation between land and sea. Amos listened, his hands never stopping, and as he listened, the transformation began. The pig's bulk became the body of a magnificent harbor seal, its rounded form now graceful rather than grotesque. The crude snout elongated into the seal's distinctive profile, whiskers added with delicate strokes. But Amos didn't stop there. Around the seal, he painted waves not simple curves, but rolling swells rendered with such skill they seemed to move in the changing light. He added kelp forests, starfish, the shadow of fish beneath the surface. The letters presented a greater challenge. "Pig lives here" remained visible beneath the new paint, a ghost that couldn't be fully erased. But Amos worked with it rather than against it, incorporating the letters into a larger design, adding strokes and curves until new words emerged. "Hope lives here." Arched above the seal, the letters formed from stylized waves and foam, the old insult completely transformed. By the second day, word had spread. Villagers began finding excuses to walk past Millicent's cabin. Captain Hendricks came by and stood silent for a full 5 minutes, then left without a word. Mrs. Chen brought fresh water and paint rags, her eyes bright with tears. Children pressed close until their parents pulled them back, not from fear, but from reverence for the work in progress. Millicent found herself emerging from the cabin more frequently, first to watch Amos work, then to help. She mixed pigments under his instruction, learning how linseed oil changed the texture, how different powders created different hues. When Amos needed a specific shade of green for the kelp, Millicent remembered the moss that grew on the rocks at low tide, and together they experimented until they created a color that seemed to glow with inner light. "You have an eye for this," Amos said as they worked. "Not everyone can see how colors interact, how they change in different light. That's a gift." On the afternoon of the third day, as Amos added the final details, the gleam in the seal's eye, the subtle gradations of light in the waves, Thomas Hendricks appeared, pale and shaking. His father stood behind him, hand heavy on his son's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, the words clearly difficult. "What we did was cruel and wrong. There's no excuse for it." Millicent looked at him, this boy who'd tormented her for years, and saw something new in his face. Not quite understanding, perhaps, but the beginning of shame, the first crack in thoughtless cruelty. She nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes. Some of us get the chance to learn from them." Thomas's relief was visible, but Captain Hendricks wasn't finished. "My son and his friends will be working extra hours on the boats for the rest of the season, no pay. And Thomas will be apprenticing with me, learning what hard work actually means. What they did—" He gestured at the door, his voice rough with emotion. "My wife saw it and wept. We raised him better than this." After they left, Amos added one final element, a small signature in the corner, but not just his name. He wrote A. Blackwood and M. Thorne, 1826, in letters so small they could barely be read, a quiet acknowledgment of partnership. The completed door became Fort Astoria's wonder. People came from across the village and from the fishing camps along the coast to see it. Captain Morrison, gruff and practical, stood before it for 15 minutes in the rain, then sought out Amos and Millicent at the trading post. "The church needs a proper altarpiece," he said without preamble. "Father Benedict has been talking about it for years, but we've had no one with the skill. Would you two consider it? We can pay in supplies, labor, whatever you need." Thus began a partnership that would transform both Millicent's life and Fort Astoria itself. The church commission led to requests from the tavern, the trading post, the schoolhouse. Every building wanted something beautiful, something that told the story of their community and its connection to the wild coast. Amos and Millicent developed a pattern of work. He would sketch the designs, drawing on his years of travel and observation, whaling ships breasting waves, indigenous patterns he'd learned from Chinook and Clatsop artists, maritime symbols, and stories. Millicent would prepare the surfaces, mixing pigments with increasing expertise, and then they would paint together, Amos handling the detailed figure work, while Millicent created the backgrounds and the subtle color gradations that made the paintings seem to breathe. She discovered a particular talent for creating pigments. The coastal environment offered unique materials, the iridescent interior of abalone shells, ground fine to create a shimmering white, oxidized copper, from old ship fittings for vivid greens and blues, clay from specific coastal deposits that yielded ochres unlike any commercial paint. Her colors became distinctive, sought after, a signature of Fort Astoria's growing reputation. Through the winter of 1826-1827, they worked. The church altarpiece depicted the miracle of the fishes, but set against the Oregon coast rather than biblical shores, the disciples' faces drawn from real fishermen of the village. The tavern's walls showed the history of exploration, Lewis and Clark meeting the Clatsop people, John Jacob Astor's fur traders founding the settlement, the ships that connected this remote outpost to the wider world. But something else was growing between them, subtle as the dawn light, changing the color of the ocean. Millicent found herself watching Amos's hands as he worked, the confident strokes of his brush, the way he squinted when considering a difficult passage. She noticed when his coffee grew cold and brought him fresh. She learned the rhythm of his breathing when he concentrated, the soft humming that meant he was pleased with his progress. Amos, for his part, began finding excuses to extend their workdays. He'd suggest mixing one more color, trying one more technique, reviewing tomorrow's work over dinner. He brought her books from his own small collection, delighted to discover she read voraciously. They discussed everything: philosophy, natural history, the politics of faraway Washington City, the mysteries of art and beauty. The village began to notice. Mrs. Chen started leaving 2 cups when she brought coffee. Captain Morrison smiled knowingly when he saw them walking together to examine a wall that needed painting. The children who'd once mocked Millicent now begged her to tell them stories while she mixed paints, and she discovered she enjoyed their bright curiosity. Spring arrived with unusual warmth, the coastal fog lifting early each morning to reveal skies of startling blue. On a Sunday in April, Amos and Millicent took a rare day away from painting to walk the beach south of the village, collecting shells and driftwood that might serve as decoration for their next project, a mural for the new schoolhouse. They walked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes only from knowing someone well. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying their eternal complaints. The tide was out, revealing tide pools filled with anemones and small crabs, the rocks glazed with seaweed that gleamed like wet silk. "I should tell you something," Amos said suddenly, stopping to face the ocean, "about why I really came to Fort Astoria, about what I've been running from." Millicent waited, sensing the importance of the moment. "I told you I killed a man in self-defense, defending a woman. That was true. What I didn't say was that the woman was my wife, Mourning Dove. We'd been married 5 years, living at a trading post on the Snake River. The man I killed was her cousin, drunk and angry that she'd married outside the tribe. He came at her with a knife, and I—" He paused, his voice rough. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. But he fell, struck his head. By the time I realized he was dead, Mourning Dove had fled. Her family thought I'd murdered him deliberately, that she'd left me. They burned our trading post, destroyed everything." He turned to look at Millicent, his eyes dark with old pain. "I searched for her for 2 years. Finally found her uncle, who told me she'd died of fever the winter after she ran. She'd been pregnant, Millicent. I didn't know. She died alone, thinking I was a murderer, carrying our child." Tears streaked his weathered face. "I came to Fort Astoria to die. I'd given up. Then Captain Morrison offered me work, and I thought maybe I could last a few more months. Then I heard about what happened to you, and something shifted. I couldn't save Mourning Dove, couldn't protect her from what happened, but maybe I could do this one thing: turn ugliness into beauty, help one person in a way I couldn't help her." Millicent felt her own tears falling. "You've given me so much more than that," she said softly. "You've given me a life I never imagined possible. You've shown me that I have value beyond my work, that I can create beauty, that I deserve—" She faltered, struggling for words. "What do you deserve?" Amos asked gently. "To be seen, to be loved, to matter to someone." The words came out in a rush, naked and vulnerable. Amos took her hands in his, calloused palms against calloused palms, the hands of workers and artists. "You matter to me, Millicent Thorne. You've become the fixed point in my life, the reason I wake grateful for each day. I'm 15 years older than you, scarred by past grief, not much to offer beyond my skill and my devotion. But if you would have me, I would spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you." The kiss that followed tasted of salt spray and tears, tentative at first, then deeper, a promise being made and accepted. Around them, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human joy but somehow encompassing it, part of the vast pattern of life that included both sorrow and redemption. They married on a June evening at sunset on the beach below Millicent's cabin, the place where she'd once hidden from the world and now stood before the entire village, radiant in a dress of indigo cloth dyed with her own pigments. Father Benedict performed the ceremony, the words of blessing carried away on the ocean breeze. Captain Morrison stood as Amos's witness, Mrs. Chen as Millicent's. Thomas Hendricks was there too, genuinely smiling, having learned something about grace and forgiveness through watching the transformation of both the door and his own character. The cabin, too small for two, was expanded that summer with help from the village. A studio was added, with windows facing north for steady light and shelves for their growing collection of pigments and tools. The famous door was preserved behind a protective frame, and Millicent insisted that the ghost of the original insult remained visible beneath Amos's artistry. "Let people see what can be transformed," she said. "Let them know that cruel words and hateful actions don't have to be the end of the story." Their reputation spread beyond Fort Astoria. Ships' captains carried news of the painted town to other ports. Traders brought commissions from settlements up and down the coast. By 1828, Fort Astoria had become known as the Painted Village, drawing visitors who marveled at the murals adorning nearly every public building. But it was their personal work that mattered most to Amos and Millicent, the small paintings they created together in the evening, experimental pieces where they could push boundaries and explore new techniques. Millicent developed a method of incorporating actual beach materials into the paint, creating textured surfaces that caught light in unexpected ways. Amos taught her portraiture, and she discovered an ability to capture not just faces, but the essence of personality, the soul behind the eyes. In the spring of 1829, Millicent confirmed what she'd suspected for 2 months: she was pregnant. The joy was complicated by Amos's immediate terror, memories of mourning dove shadowing the happiness. But Millicent weathered pregnancy with the same practical strength she'd brought to everything else, continuing to paint until the day before her labor began. Their daughter, Emily Morning Blackwood, arrived on a stormy October night, delivered by Mrs. Chen, with half the village's women assisting. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin, and from her first breath seemed to possess a will as strong as the ocean itself. Parenthood transformed them again. Amos, who'd been convinced he'd never have a family, became almost foolishly devoted, painting a series of murals in the nursery depicting fairy tales and ocean adventures. Millicent discovered reserves of fierce protectiveness she'd never known she possessed, along with wells of patience for the endless demands of infant care. Emily grew up literally covered in paint, crawling across drop cloths, learning to mix colors before she could properly speak. By age 3, she was adding her own touches to her parents' work, random splashes and handprints that Amos and Millicent carefully preserved, incorporating into their designs. On a cool October morning in 1836, exactly 10 years after the night someone painted "Pig" on Millicent's door, Fort Astoria dedicated its new community hall, the largest building in the village, designed specifically as a gallery for the town's growing collection of art. The walls displayed the best works of Amos and Millicent, along with pieces by artists from across the territory. But the central position was reserved for something special. The original cabin door, carefully removed and preserved, hung in a place of honor. Amos and Millicent had created a surrounding installation, a series of panels showing the transformation process, photographs of sketches, samples of pigments, written descriptions of their technique and philosophy. But more than that, they'd invited Thomas Hendricks, now married with children of his own and working as his father's partner, to add his own contribution. Thomas had spent 6 months creating a written account of that night, his motivations, his shame, and what he'd learned. He wrote with painful honesty about the casual cruelty of youth, the way shame and fear could twist into mockery, the grace he'd witnessed in Millicent's forgiveness. The document, beautifully lettered by his wife, who'd once been a school teacher in Boston, hung beside the door. "My children will see this," Thomas said during the dedication ceremony, his voice steady but emotional. "They'll know what their father did, and they'll know that we're all capable of causing harm. But they'll also see that redemption is possible, that art and love can transform even the ugliest acts into something that gives hope." 7-year-old Emily stood between her parents, fidgeting in her best dress, impatient with adult speech-making. She tugged on Millicent's hand. "Mama, can I paint now? Papa promised we could work on the lighthouse piece after this." Millicent smiled, feeling the weight of the decade, the pain, the transformation, the unexpected joy of building a life she'd never imagined possible. She looked at Amos, who met her gaze with the quiet contentment of a man who'd found his way home after years of wandering. "Yes, darling," she said, "let's go paint." The years continued their patient march. Fort Astoria grew into a proper town, though it would always be known as the Painted Village. Millicent's unique pigments became sought after by artists across the Western Territories and even in San Francisco, creating an unexpected source of income. She trained apprentices in her methods, young people drawn by the reputation of her work and the warmth of her teaching. Amos's health began to decline in his mid-50s, the hard years of whaling and mountain life catching up with his frame. But he painted until the last year of his life, working on increasingly detailed miniatures when larger works became too difficult. He created a series of tiny paintings for Emily, each one depicting a lesson or memory he wanted to preserve for her the day she first mixed ultramarine, the summer they painted the new schoolhouse together, the evening she announced she wanted to study art in San Francisco. He died on a clear spring morning in 1845, sitting in his chair by the window with a brush in his hand, looking out at the ocean that had been both his torment and his salvation. Millicent held him as he slipped away, whispering her love, thanking him for giving her a life beyond the small, frightened existence she once accepted as her fate. The grief was profound, but not paralyzing. She painted through it, creating a series of oceanscapes that captured both the violence and beauty of the sea, works that eventually hung in the territorial capital and were reproduced in Eastern newspapers. She became known not just as Amos Blackwood's widow, but as an artist in her own right, her distinctive style instantly recognizable. Emily returned from San Francisco with her own artistic training and a young man she'd met at the academy, a talented sculptor named David Chin, grandson of Mrs. Chin, who'd been so kind during Millicent's darkest days. They married in 1850 and established a studio next to Millicent's, creating works that combined painting and sculpture in ways that drew collectors from across the country. Millicent lived to see Fort Astoria connect to the wider world through improved roads and, eventually, telegraph lines. She witnessed the California gold rush bring an influx of settlers to the coast. She saw her grandchildren, 3 in total, learn to paint and sculpt, carrying forward the family tradition. But of all her accomplishments, the thing she treasured most remained that original door. In 1860, when she was 57 and recognized as one of the foremost artists in Oregon Territory, a museum curator from New York offered an extraordinary sum for the piece. Millicent refused. "Some things," she wrote in reply, "are not for sale. This door represents more than art or history. It represents the truth that we are not defined by what others try to make us. The ugliness others impose on us can be transformed, but only if we're brave enough to stay, to fight, to create something better from the wreckage." She donated the door to the town of Fort Astoria instead, with the stipulation that it remain accessible to everyone free of charge, a reminder that beauty can emerge from pain and that redemption is always possible. Millicent Thorne Blackwood died peacefully in her sleep on a foggy March morning in 1867 at the age of 64. Fort Astoria closed entirely for her funeral, the entire population, now over 3,000 people, lining the streets as her casket, painted with her own designs, was carried to the cemetery overlooking the ocean. The cabin where her life had transformed stood empty for a time, preserved exactly as she'd left it, her brushes still in their jars, her final painting incomplete on the easel. Emily eventually converted it into a small museum, the Fort Astoria Heritage House, where the story of the painted door and the woman who refused to be defined by cruelty was told to each new generation. The door itself remains in the community hall's central gallery, carefully maintained, lit with modern lighting that brings out the subtle gradations of Millicent's pigments. Visitors trace the ghosted outline of that original pig, seeing both the insult and its transformation, understanding in a visceral way that the choice is always ours. We can let ugliness define us, or we can create something better. On the wall beside it, a brass plaque reads, "Hope lives here," in memory of Millicent Thorne Blackwood, 1803-1867, who taught us that the cruelest acts can be transformed by art, courage, and love. May all who enter here remember that we are not what others call us, but what we choose to become. And every year, on the anniversary of that October night when someone painted cruelty on a lonely woman's door, the people of Fort Astoria, now incorporated as Astoria, Oregon, a thriving coastal city, gather at the Heritage House to celebrate Transformation Day. Artists, young and old, bring works created from reclaimed materials, found objects, or situations meant to harm that were instead turned into beauty. Children learn the story of Millicent and Amos, and local artists give free lessons in pigment making using coastal materials, keeping alive the techniques Millicent pioneered. The tradition has spread. Across Oregon and beyond, communities hold similar celebrations, recognizing that Millicent's story is universal, the story of anyone who's been diminished, mocked, or attacked, and who found the strength not to hide, but to transform their pain into something that lifts others. In the museum, preserved in climate-controlled cases, lie Millicent's journals, thousands of pages documenting her techniques, her thoughts on art and life, her deepest fears and greatest joys. Students and scholars come from around the world to study them, but the entry most often quoted, most often copied and shared, was written on her 10th anniversary with Amos. I was taught by experience to make myself small, to hide, to apologize for the space I occupied in the world. Someone painted a pig on my door, and I thought it was the truth that I was ugly, unwanted, worthy only of mockery. But Amos showed me another truth, that we are all canvases, and while others may mar us with their cruelty, we have the power to transform those marks into something beautiful. The pig became a seal. The insult became hope. My loneliness became love, and my shame became art. This is the gift we give ourselves when we refuse to accept the story others write for us, when we pick up our own brushes and paint our lives with truth, courage, and hope. The ocean that rolls against the Oregon coast continues its eternal rhythm, indifferent yet encompassing, part of the vast pattern that includes both the darkness of October 1826 and the light that followed. And on clear mornings, when the fog lifts and the sun strikes the preserved door in the Heritage House just right, the colors seem to glow from within Millicent's unique pigments, still brilliant after all these years, still telling their story of transformation, still offering hope to anyone who needs reminding that the cruelest wound can become the most beautiful scar, a testament not to what was done to us, but to what we became in spite of it.